Okay, now I can officially start. So welcome to now our already 17th critical dialogue on reconciliation. My name is Lucia. I'm a member of Rodeemos el Diálogo, or Embrace Dialogue, as we're known in the UK. Today we'll be exploring a really both topical but also intriguing topic of the connection between the military and reconciliation in Colombia. I'm personally very excited for our guest that André will soon introduce and for this conversation. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. So this event is part of a series of dialogues organized by the Winchester Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, which is part of the University of Winchester, Embrace Dialogue, and the Oxford Network Studies, also known as OxPeace. And the aim of the dialogues is to start a multicultural, interdisciplinary global dialogue about reconciliation. So for everyone who's joining us for the first time, I think most of the people in this Zoom have been with us before, but perhaps for the people on YouTube, just briefly who we are. So Rodeemos el Diálogo is a Colombian peace-building organization promoting the culture of dialogue. In a few moments, André will tell you a little bit more about what the culture of dialogue means to us as an organization and what it will mean in this dialogue today. In terms of the work that we do, we're involved in various aspects of peace building and reconciliation. We do some work in Colombia on ground, for example, peace pedagogy and youth-led projects, but we also do events on a global level, for example, dialogues such as this one today. And we always kind of strive to take the learnings from Colombia and try to share them with other places around the world, but also try to continuously learn from other places around the world and bring those learnings back to Colombia. Specifically through this series of events, we will continue inviting practitioners, academics, and decision makers to share their research and activities around reconciliation process. But the most important people really are all the participants of the dialogue who join. So no matter what your background, where you're from, we're interested in your thoughts on the topics we discuss. So also today, I will invite you all to participate. I think that's always the most engaging and rewarding part of the dialogues we have. And if you like today's event, I invite you to follow our work in the future, and I will post the links to where you can do so both in the Zoom chat, but also on YouTube. But I think that's basically it. So once again, on behalf of Embrace Dialogue, the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace at the University of Winchester, and the Oxford Network for Peace Studies, welcome. I'm now handing over to Dr. André Gomez Suarez, Senior Research Fellow at the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, member of the OxPeace Steering Committee, and a co-founder of the Rodeemos el Diálogo, who will convene today's dialogue and also introduce today's special guest, and start by introducing you to the culture of dialogue. André, here you go.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's always great to co-convene this with you. And thank you so much, Alejandra, for accepting this invitation today. I will introduce Alexandra shortly. It is very good to see so many of you here again today. I see old faces and new faces, and that is great. Welcome to this space. Following the ethos of Rodeemos el Diálogo, and precisely with what Lucia had said, let me just remind ourselves what are the core principles of the culture of dialogue that we invite you to embrace today in order to have a transformative space. The first principle is generosity. We invite you to be fully present for the next hour and 20 minutes to try to stop your thoughts and nurture thinking. The second principle is solidarity. We invite you to unleash empathy, to act with compassion after listening to the different stories, thoughts, ideas, memories that are going to be shared in this space. The third principle is co-responsibility. We invite you to hold this space together. It depends of all of us to make this dialogue a stream of meaning flowing between and amongst us. The fourth principle is honesty. We invite you to speak from experience and to be genuine. The fifth principle is respect. We invite you to see your own reactions to the ideas of other people, to see your own assumptions, and to try to suspend judgment, to nurture awe. And the final principle is self-criticism. We invite you to not confuse your assumptions with reality, but instead be critical and open to change your mind, to nurture intellectual humility. These are the principles that will sustain this dialogue today. We understand dialogue as a horizontal transformative process, which gets closer to what David Bohm calls a stream of meaning flowing among and through and between us. So the invitation is to leave aside all patterns of interaction. This is not a seminar. This is a space of spontaneity for us to think together and see our individuals' patterns of thoughts and our inconsistencies. So today's structure is as follows. The first 30 minutes, Laura, Alejandra, and myself will kick off the dialogue. We will share some ideas with you and we will leave them on the table. Please, we invite you not to drop any comments on the chat, but instead to allow your own thought process to flow, to see your own patterns of thinking. And then I will facilitate a collective dialogue, bringing you in with Alejandra. And then in that moment, we will invite you to turn your camera on and to voice your comments or your questions and to try to be part of this stream of meaning that we're building together. As Lucia said, this dialogue is being live streamed, so please be aware of that. Towards the end of this space, the idea is that I will wrap up in 5 minutes to try to offer some food for thought of what has emerged in this space that we have been sharing together. So without further ado, let me introduce and welcome our very special guest today to the 17th Critical Dialogue on Reconciliation. Alejandra Ortiz Ayala got a PhD from the University of Otago. She is currently research associate and head of the conflict and conflict management specialization at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt. Before being at the school, she was a research assistant and fellow on a participatory active research project with refugee background young people in southern New Zealand at the School of Education of the University of Otago. Alejandra is a political scientist from Colombia. She studied her BA at Los Andes University. She spent several years as a lecturer, researcher, and consultant for national and international organizations in Colombia, such as the National Center for Historical Memory, where actually we somehow overlap in a particular moment in time, the School of War, and the Folk Barnardo Academy. Her current research interest incorporates 4 areas. First, the role of the security sector in war to peace transitions in Latin America. Second, the influence of ideology on people, political behavior, violence mobilization, radicalism, and armed groups' behavior in the context of civil war and beyond. Third, the social cohesion in the context of civilian displacement and resettlement during and post-civil wars in the context of Colombia and New Zealand. And finally, and perhaps more importantly for our dialogue today, the mechanisms for reconciliation between victims and perpetrators, particularly between state, armed actors, and civilians in post-peace agreements context. So we couldn't have a best guest speaker for this topic. I'm thrilled, Alejandra, because in previous dialogues, we have been, in the last dialogue, we talked about the FARC. So we've been talking about the illegal armed groups. Before then, we talk about the role of youth in reconciliation. We've spoken about the role of civil society, and we have never really engaged with the role of the military. So this is great, and thank you so much. So let me start with the first question for you so that we start this dialogue and see where it takes us. Could you summarize for us, for this global audience, and take stock of the main wrongdoings of the Colombian army or the Colombian military during the armed conflict in Colombia?
Hello, everyone. Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me and for considering my work sort of important for your discussions. Well, I've been working with the military since 2014. I've been working with them as part of the School of War, and then doing connections between governmental institutions and the security sector. So kind of building a bridge between the National Center of History and Memory and the security forces. If you are aware of who is Maria Emma Wills, she just published a book, and there is a special chapter where she actually talks about this interlocution between the military and the National Center of History and Memory, and I was part of that team. So I prefer to disclose my positionality because I believe that matters a lot for people that is aware of the Colombian context, but even people that is not really familiar. Accessing the military in Colombia is really complicated if you are a completely outsider, and I'm a completely outsider. I don't have any family members that is part of the military. I'm a completely no any kind of ties to them, which is very not normal. I mean, the normal thing is that people that used to develop a research agenda about the military in Colombia is because they have some family connection with them, or the wife of someone or stuff like that. But for completely outsiders is really hard. And the reason why I got in, it was because in 2014, there was a particular moment in history. That was the report of the Basta Jack came out, and the military reactors towards that. And there were some veterans within the School of War that decided that they needed to hear civilians that they were not necessarily tied to them to talk with them. So there were kind of a historical disposition and a window opportunity for people like me to get in. So with this thing, I believe in that positionality matters for everything, to be honest. Now I can answer your question. The way that I think about the wrongdoings of the military is, I will probably quote Francisco Leal, who is a very prominent scholar from Colombia, who basically say that there was a convenient relationship between the civilians and the military in terms of the autonomy of the security sector towards security, and that the security sector will not be involved in politics. So basically, is this also classic quotation of Geras Camargo that say, you know what, I don't want the armed forces to decide what the nation is going to be governed, and I also don't want any kind of civilian telling the military what to do. And this kind of agreement of be kind of this missing kind of the responsibility of the civilian, and literally just handed all the security responsibility to the military, I think explains part of the reason why there were some abuses of the force of the security sector. So it's not like I'm completely disengaged the responsibility of the military and blaming completely the civilians. It was actually a convenient agreement. I don't want, it's literally, I don't want to know what you're doing, but don't touch my territory either. So there were a really cool event in 2014, 16 or something, I don't recall well the date, but it was in the Rosario University, and the general commander at that time was Mejia, who is actually, I think, is teaching in the University of Los Andes nowadays. And he says something in front of the audience that was mainly military people. And he says something it was the times of the peace agreement with the FARC, and he said, we don't going to allow any civilian or international organization to transform us. We are the one who going to transform us and to rethink about the security sector in the post-conflict. So again, it's this idea that they don't want any civilian or any international organization to think about stuff related with security sector reform. And that was actually not part of the agenda. So Colombia is kind of a very special kind of case in that regard, because, and actually the FARC did a very important concession in allowing the government to not include a security sector reform in the peace agenda. That was kind of like a red line that the military actually like draw and say, you want the peace agreement, that's great, but nothing related with the security sector reform is going to be included in the agenda. And they managed to continue with the process without that, which again is very unique if we look into case studies in terms of what the things that a peace agreement should include. So historically, I will say that this kind of lack of appropriation of the civilian control allowed the military to also instrumentalize that relationship and say, well, if we commit mistake, it's not because of us, it's because of the military, it's because of the civilians. So, and I will probably mention this later on, but keep that in mind, that this instrumentalization of this autonomy is being actually really important for the narrative of the security sector nowadays in front of transitional justice. The second thing is that we historically assumed kind of the neutrality of the armed forces in the conflict. And the Colombian conflict in Colombia is not pure military. It was a conflict that had a very strong ideological cleavages. And the military in itself, since the origins, and even probably it was more evident during the Cold War, have a very strong ideological preferences. They were not just fighting rebels, they were fighting left-wing rebels. And that impacted the way that they define security and also how they perceive civilians with certain ideological identities. So basically, my PhD thesis was about this, was about how to, literally, I did an experimental survey to measure the ideological bias on the soldiers, middle ranks and lower ranks, in their dispositions of willingness to protect civilians. And I was able to actually measure it through a experimental survey. So this is the thing, is that we may, and now we are like actually seeing this as well in the narratives of the soldiers that are in front of the hip, saying that the reason why they target certain civilians was also driven by the ideology of that civilians. So the falsos positivos, some of those falsos positivos were people that was associated with left-wing political ideas. So it was worth them to kill them. So that mentality, or what I call in my thesis, that war mentality, is something that is, I mean, is ideological identity driver. It still persists nowadays in the military. And I will say that also explain the wrongdoings of the military during conflict. So we don't see the military as an institution that was affected in the way that they believe about what kind of civilians have worked to protect or not through these ideological lenses. We may not understand the relationship with civilians and how they commit the wrongs during the conflict. So I will kind of, if I needed to explain the wrongdoings of the military, I will talk about these ideological biases that are related with the wartime cleavages and the behavior of the army, and also the relationship with the leadership, the civilian leadership and the military during the conflict.
That's great, Alejandra. And I think this really for those who do not understand Colombia, this really helps to see the big picture. And you mentioned precisely President Lleras Camargo, who was president in the 1950s, who was the one who created this particular relationship between the civilians and the military. And it's true. And I think listening to what you were saying, I think that one of the things that the FARC in the middle of the peace process with the Colombian government tried to do was to sort of set an account of the past by creating the Commission of the Conflict and the Victims, of which Maria Emma was precisely one of the commissioners, to try to, you know, sort of take stock of what had happened in the middle of the negotiations, to have this sort of 6 academics from one side and 6 academics from the other side trying to offer this sort of thing. Listening to you, the other thing that comes to my memory, the first thing that it triggered, in particular, the second dimension of, you know, the ideological dimension of the military and this lack of neutrality, is that my family, my dad, actually, we suffer an attack, or like the military stormed our house because my dad was member of the Patriotic Union in Colombia. So as a child, for me, the military was not neutral at all. For me, it was not really there to protect civilians, but was to actually put in danger civilians, because my dad was just a professor from a university, but we suffered that violence from the military. So in you know, thinking about this, the other thing that I would like to ask you, and probably, you know, because it was a very serious concern for many people because of the violence that they suffered in the 1980s and 1990s, was how that ideological dimension that you mentioned of the army allowed them to build coalitions with criminal actors. So could you explain a bit, if possible, the relationship between the military and either drug lords or paramilitary groups in the sort of contributing to the wrongdoings that took place during the conflict?
Well, I will say that we may need to, I mean, in the voices of the military, they are divided. So there are military members that they probably will argue that this never happens, or if it happened was just few of them. Others will probably tell you that it was true, that there were certain military or even more geographically located militaries located in certain areas of the country that have a strong relationship with, for example, paramilitary groups or even drug cartels. But even today, and I will probably going to separate between the military and the police, we don't have a really good data about that relationship. So I will say that, for example, Francisco Gutierrez Sanin, he has certain idea of the relationship of the paramilitary with the police. And he's been more like trying to tackle that relationship more, but we don't have much information, again, in a subnational level of how that works with the military, because it was different. I mean, and changed over time as well. So we don't have enough empirical evidence or systematic evidence of that relationship. So I will say that there were certain militaries that they were actually like working with, but not necessarily directly committing the wrongdoings. So I can give you an example. They were probably doing some rounds of security rounds in certain areas, but they got some calls and say, please don't come these days. So by omission, they decided not to go to certain areas, so the other group can do what they needed to do. So there was these kind of things. In another, I have also, from my interviews and my conversations with the military, some of them disclose information like, Alejandra, we were actually not aware of this relationship until we were in the battle, and we were literally like almost losing the battle. But in some point, we got some help. And that help they were not necessarily military members. And they say, well, it was not because of that help, we will probably not be alive. So in terms of how the military works in the field, I mean, in the middle of the war, our military in certain years, they were not as professional, not necessarily have the equipment that they have nowadays, for example. The military supported a lot. Got support from other groups. But then what was very interesting, at least for me, it was that then we got this injection of investment from the US with Plan Colombia. And what we know from even nowadays, like data and everything, is that not even that actually empowered the military in terms of be more present in certain areas, be more like professionalized in terms of more courses and more like the proper weapons and stuff. But that not necessarily means that they were able to ensure protection of all civilians. Still, they were delivering protection in an unwavering way. And also the relationship with these illegal groups still persist. But what is still, I will say, is still something that we need to do more research about, is that it was not homogenic. When we think about the military, we cannot think about the military as a homogenic institution that act in the same way in all the territories. No, there were certain militaries that have really and developed really good relationship with civilians in certain areas. In other areas, they were not necessarily like that, but that changed over time as well. So what we may need to do, like in terms of research, if this is something that someone wants to go into, is to track that relationship in the subnational level with the security sector, to see how the army in itself, or the police, or the state institutions have been establishing relationship with non-state armed actors, how that's been happening in the subnational level, and how it changed. Because I think that it's been the same.
That sets the scene for a really important question, because what I think many Colombians, many victims of the conflict, many people would be expecting is that if the military are participating in transitional justice mechanisms, these sort of situations at the subnational level should be clarified. So could you please tell us whether the military are participating in the transitional justice mechanisms that were created in the framework of the 2016 peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC, that created at least two really important transitional justice institutions, the Truth Commission and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. So what do we know about that?
Well, so the military as an institution is disengaged of these mechanisms. The soldiers that we've been seeing in the Truth Commissions, they are there individually. They don't have institutional support. Actually, there is a foundation led by one of the military that was accused of falsos positivos. He was in jail. He actually studied law, and he created this foundation to support legally soldiers to prepare their declarations in front of the Truth Commission. So this group of soldiers that are being participating, some of them are unprotected, some of them have been receiving threats, actually, but their narratives and their versions are being very important, because allow us to see this kind of the institutional mechanisms that allow them to do certain things, because what's a whole structure? I mean, in the case, we will want to think about the case 03 that is in the True Commission that was there. And
sorry, in the special jurisdiction.
The special jurisdictions for peace, yes. So they've been saying really, really important things. But if you ask me as the collective is not necessarily actively involved, which I believe is a terrible mistake from the institutional point of view, because this is a tremendous window opportunity for the military to heal the relationship with the civilians. And it was just until the 3 of October that the Minister of Defense and the General Commander of the military forces that did this public apology in Bogota in front of the mothers of Suacha, accepting the extrajudicial executions. But again, this just happened this month. But if you go and talk with the people of the military in general or the state security forces, they are actually playing and not talking that much about it. So I believe that we are losing an important moment in terms of in the institutional level. But the individual contributions are being very, I think they are going to be super useful for us to tackle this relationship with illegality and the state, also the relationship with the private sector and the state, and how the private sector also use the security forces for personal protection and to kind of also in a biased way use security forces. The other thing that I will mention is we had a mayor, part of the commissioners, the Mayor Ospina. He was part of the report, but few months before the report was published, he actually resigned and argued that his voice and the voice of the military as an institution was not taken into consideration in their report, and that he believed that there were some ideological biases in the report. And few months later, I think it was not even few months, like a couple of months later, he published a counter-report. So basically, he probably used the time that he was being a commissioner writing this counter-report, because it's impossible that you write a counter-report in just 2 months, right? So he was actually already, he and his team, he was prepared to contest it, the report. And in one of the, I read it, and one of the main arguments that you can find in there is that they displace the entire responsibilities of the wrongdoings of the military during conflict to politicians. So that's the connection that I wanted to do with my first intervention, is this instrumentalization that the security forces has been doing with the civilians in terms of saying, yes, we want autonomy, but then if you give us autonomy, so you are the one who is responsible when we're doing wrong. And here I think we, and probably I'm going to talk more as an academic, I believe that academia has also something to do with this. Most part of the academia in Colombia that been studied the security forces for certain years are doing from the critical perspective. Some scholars are probably already people that have been working with temas like security topics, is people that have been doing this for years. We need more people. We need fresh blood, actually, in these topics in Colombia. But it's people that has already been saying the same things over and over. They already have a relationship with the security sector, but I will say that they never been working with or inside the institutions. It's like, yes, I will say not that much. And And most part of the things are related with more criticizing the institution, but not considering the institution, to study the institution and say, okay, we're not going to get rid of the army. We're not going to get rid of the police. We may need to work with them because we need them still. What we can do to improve them. And for that, you need to be able to work with them and talk to them and probably confront yourself. I don't know if you are familiar with the moral imagination sort of a term, but requires a lot. And keeping the relationship that I have with the military, I will say, requires a lot of moral imagination and all a constant reflection. But I'm doing it because I think it's worth it to have a close relationship with the military, to be able to conduct certain research that allow us to disclose certain things that they probably don't want to see about themselves, but we as a civil society, we need to be responsible of be accountable to them, and also to push the military, like the military and the civilians, to have a more like actual democratic relationship. We don't have in the Congress, for example, experts in the security sector. We don't have. We only came out with a certain thing about the security sector when we are selecting the generals, and then the Congress is just saying like, oh, this guy no because did this thing bad or whatever. But we don't have actually in the Congress an institution that can do control of the security forces. We don't have, for example, a national security program. Every time that we have a new president, we need to update the national security program, which is, like, I believe, a huge problem because we don't have consistency in terms of the priorities that we want as a nation, in terms of what we want or what we define as security, how we imagine security, how we want the security to be displaced in the territories. But we don't have much of this, neither expertise, and in practice, we actually, because of the lack of civil society, and also I will say that in the last years we have more, but still we need more like push from the civil society and also politicians, because then in practice, the people who end in making these decisions are the military. So we need to be there. So they are not allowed to continue saying, oh, well, you leave us alone, or if we do something wrong, it's because the politicians. No, we may need to work together to be all responsible of what we expect from them. So in general, I will say that this moment of time is a window opportunity for us to rethink most of these things. But unfortunately, I don't see the willingness of the military as an institution. And I see also, despite of the new government and the new Minister of Defense, I think they are being kind of shy.
Let me get in there and ask you another question, Alejandra, because I think you have put a lot of things on the table, and I think this is getting us closer to. You have mentioned the moral imagination. That is a concept by John Paul Lederach, and he invites us to this challenging journey. But I guess, and as I was listening to you, I mean, sometimes the role of individuals is very important. We actually hosted an event at the University of Winchester, in which we invited Rodrigo Londoño, the former chief in command of the FARC, to talk about what makes reconciliation possible. And I keep thinking about, how many members of the secretariat of the FARC have been asking for an apology, have acknowledged responsibility, have apologized over the last 2 or 3 or 5 years. And I know, you check the news here and there, and you see that there are some generals actually who are not only acknowledging responsibility for their own wrongdoings, but actually finger pointing the president of the nation. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but in a way, they are saying these things did happen. And actually, I think I saw in the last 2 or 3 weeks a trip that a member of the military and Rodrigo Londoño did to Europe to talk about both from a sort of military perspective, how they believe that the road towards reconciliation is possible, and how, even though they were fighting and trying to kill each other, they now can work together for reconciliation. So before we open the floor for people to come in with their own thoughts and questions and ideas, I wanted to ask you this last question. How do you see the challenges or the opportunities mentioning these things for reconciliation in Colombia, either not only with the institution in general, but probably also the role that individuals can play to try to start moving in that direction?
Well, if I'm honest with you, I think that the people that is being participating in these individual initiatives, some of them are veterans, or some of them are people that were working when there were the peace agreement, but they don't have necessarily a strong influence within the institution. And this is what I'm worried about, because I'm working with the people, the active soldiers, the people who is like in the field. So think about what happened in Tierra Alta. It was not just like that was this year. We still seen the military committing abuses towards civilians, and certain particular civilians, because they probably considered them as a threat or potential threats. So if we are not able to tackle what made the militaries on the ground to justify the abuse of the use of force against civilians, I don't think that those initiatives are going to be meaningful. We need pedagogy within the army. So, for example, an opportunity is actually, and this was a recommendation from the Truth Commission, was this like literally show the reports of the the Truth Commission within the security sector. But this is not happening. So also the individuals are contributing with the truth right now. They are perceived within the military as traitors. So that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about the actual transformation of the military inside their mindset, their perception and behavior. I don't see the willingness right now for it. And that's why even if you see these individual initiatives of there is possible, I don't see any of that, at least with my interlocutors in my research, in my encounters with the military lately.
Alejandra, one final question, and please, I ask our participants here in the room to start putting your hands up in terms of, sharing your own experiences, and probably to start thinking about what do you think should be the meaningful role of the military. So this is a question for all the people who are sitting in this room, not Alejandra, because she would like to hear that opinion from you. What do you think will have to happen for the military to show a meaningful approach to reconciliation, either in Colombia or in the conflict settings, wherever you are working or doing research? But before we get into that, so that we're putting that on the table, do you think, and this is a very short question, do you think that if someone like General Mora was the general who actually represented the military in the peace negotiations in Havana, and many people respected him quite a lot, and he managed to keep the consensus within the military to avoid the military to become spoilers. And once the negotiations finished, he became one of the main critics of the peace agreement, and he was critic of the Truth Commission. But do you think that if a leader like him was to become a leader for reconciliation, just like Timoshenko on the side of the FARC, for example? Do you think that something like that would have a higher influence within the military in order to do these transformations alongside the pedagogical exercises that the Truth Commission has suggested that need to happen? To what degree it is important to acknowledge responsibility publicly by the leaders of the military in order to move the whole institution forward, but also in order for the victims to start feeling some relief that something like that is happening?
Well, I probably, and this again probably is a personal opinion, but I'm very skeptical of the power of just individuals. I believe that we need more than that, because Mora was an individual that was able to do certain things in certain period of time, but he actually shifted completely afterwards. And I've been seeing that a lot. I mean, he's not the first one that I've been seeing that at the beginning, they have like certain, and again, this is probably just information about the identity of what means to be a member of the military, and also people that has been doing research with the military in post-conflict scenarios. They argue that for combatants in general, and especially for state combatants, admitting the wrongdoings in the past can be really hard, because it implies an identity crisis, implies that your own image of that you being the hero, like the person who was protecting and like saving the land, it was not true. And living with that, it could be really hard. So there is a beautiful sociological, is a sociology who wrote a really beautiful book from the North Island case. I can share the title later, but he talked about it as an identity crisis. And I believe that that happens with the military and with members within the military. So I think that need to be a more collective kind of approach. And also we can take advantage of the generational change. I think that is intergenerational change when you can see the potential actually change within the military. And I'm just going to give one example of that. In 2019, when I was doing my fieldwork, the New York Times published a very, was a scandal, because of the new government started to ask for certain kind of like results in the field that members within the military say, this is going to activate the perverse incentive that ending in the extrajudicial executions. It was members of the military who contact and talk with the reporter of the New York Times, which means that there is members within the military that they can resist and disagree, but they are minority. And I will say that these are the voices that the new government should empower. They are there. But the problem when you are in an institution like the army is that when you have a critical mindset, it's really hard for you to survive. And especially in a context like Colombia, when if you are a member of the military, this is your only way of living. And if you get out of this, you're probably not going to be able to get a job afterward. So there is certain structural conditions that make it really hard to kind of encourage critical mindset within the military, but I believe that is possible. And I think the new generation is actually way more aware of the opportunity that we have as in this moment to acknowledge the wrongdoings in the past, for example.
Alejandra, that's brilliant. I mean, we actually were talking about identity in the last critical dialogue on reconciliation, the sort of identity crisis that has to happen for reconciliation to take place, and in particular in the case of the FARC. And by chance, the person who wants to jump in first was our guest speaker for the last critical dialogue on reconciliation. So I'm gonna hand over to her, Laura Acosta Hankin, to jump into this dialogue, and then we will see we will go to the next person. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Andre. And apologies, I'm not going to put my camera on because my connection is really bad. I've missed little sections of what you've said, unfortunately, Alejandro, but I'm going to go back and listen again after this. But yeah, agreed, like a lot of identity stuff that's been coming up that I just wanted to chip in on. And also because I'm based in Dawewa, where false positives cases has been obviously like right at the center of it. And I think there's a lot that's come out from what you've said around that I just wanted to reflect on. It's not necessarily questions. One thing I did have back to what you were just talking about though, around being critical within the military, I think is always a tension that exists there, because by definition, you have to follow orders. So you can't be overly critical and go, oh, actually, no, I don't agree with that, because by definition, you're given an order and you need to follow it. Obviously, in leadership, it's slightly different, but even then there's hierarchy of leaders, you know. So I think there's always a tension there that's really interesting to play out and try and understand how much agency anyone can actually have within the military. But I wanted to go more around and bringing back in Andre's question of reconciliation and the role and thinking around acknowledgement in particular. Because I think one issue is acknowledging wrongdoings and the judicial implications that has for it. Because when we're thinking of a lot of the wrongdoings, there are cases that have been put forward by victims to the Ministry of Defence as incident. So, you know, saying that the state was responsible, the armed forces were responsible. And I don't know how easy it is at this point in time for the military to turn around and say, yes, collectively, because Alejandro's absolutely right, there's a difference individual and collective of what's going on, to be able to collectively say, we were responsible for this case in particular. And when you look at their responses currently, it's very much, it was too long ago, we don't know, or it wasn't anything to do with us, it was that individual. And I think that's where there's a big problem for reconciliation at the moment with victims. And I think just final thoughts, sorry, they'll have more thoughts as well. I've had lots of thoughts all the way through. I'm loving this dialogue today so far. I think that whole identity around hero is fascinating. And actually, I think there's one of the false positive cases that is a brilliant example of all of the tensions and resistance and things that can come up. Thinking of the father of one of the victims who was in the army and was executed because he didn't want to follow through with what they were doing. He was in the army as well. And his relationship now is very interesting. He actually says he feels far more comfortable and trusts, for example, the FARC. He doesn't want to share, for example, a meal. He doesn't trust the army in that respect. But there's a whole history there around how he feels about his own relationship with what he was doing previously when he was in the army, how he feels about it now, how he feels about it in terms of his son. And I think when we start to see that and unpick that, I think that's where, we get into what does it actually mean to be in the military. But I think it's really important the work that you're doing, Alejandro, and the fact that outsiders, as you put it, can come in and critically reflect. As you say, the challenge is how the military can also be open. The military and police, you're right, can be open to those reflections and move forward in constructive transformation. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, Lau. I mean, great. Thanks so much for all that food for thought that you're bringing into this stream of meaning. I can see that also Peter is wanting to join us in this dialogue. So, Peter, over to you.
Hey, I appear to be completely in the dark. Forgive me for that. Afternoon, and thanks for your time. Fascinating topic. Some of these reflections might come out as questions, and if any of it you kind of want to come back in on, that's great. Don't really have to respond to everything. Yeah, I mean, in the line of what you and Laura were just saying about the military, sort of military's self-understanding as the héroes de la patria, no, as the heroes. I guess in part of that is also the kind of the idea of military honor, and I wonder how much that has come out in your dialogues, tangentially or central to it. I found in just I mean, I've had the occasion to work in Colombia on different occasions, and my first job in particular kind of required me to kind of have sort of an institutional dialogue as part of the organization I was working with the military. And I found it, this was sort of back in 2009, 2010, I found them completely opaque. And I never knew, I say this, I said it then, and I kind of use the phrase still, that I never knew if the military kind of saw what they were doing with us as an international organization as sweet talk or small talk, whether they were just tolerating us with small talk until we left the room and then they could move on to their next thing, or whether they actually thought we had some degree of influence and needed to sweet talk us. And to this day, I'm not sure if it was either or both, or I found them very, very hard to read. But on the kind of the broader point of civil military relations, I heard you mention the government a couple of times, but I'm interested perhaps to raise the point about this government in particular, the Petro government, which might not be thought of immediately as a natural ally of the military institution. And so kind of beyond just a civil military thing, whether the mediating influence of this particular government is playing out in a particular way. Other thing that sort of I was just wondering about was whether you knew of any sort of good, like, best practice around this, or that you've picked up practice in civil military relations from other militaries that could be useful for the Colombian case. And finally, just a point about issue about conscientious objection, which seems quite sort of relevant in the context of reconciliation. For some years, I think there's been the right to conscientious objection was declared by the Constitutional Court, and then that has played out in certain ways, a bit of resistance, but also recognition at the same time. And now this whole question of an alternative service, and whether or not those dynamics could also kind of play in some way to the to the questions that we're discussing today. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Peter. You brought an array of new topics and ideas, and I guess, you know, there's a lot on the table, Alejandra, and it'd be just nice, I think, for the time being, take stock where you are, so you don't need to answer the question as such, but probably ideas, thoughts, where you are. Please join in, and let's see whether people continue putting their hands up to contribute to our dialogue.
Well, the first thing that I will say is that there is a beautiful triangle that say, like, in post-conflict scenarios, we are in between of heroes, victims, or perpetrators. See, like, this is kind of the roles, and the military have a tension between heroes and victims. If you hear, like, if you are like tracking their narratives, they also portray themselves as victims sometimes, especially when they want to be acknowledged about the violation of human according with international law. So there is, like, in certain cases that the military can be recognized as victims, but when they did that, they confront themselves, because in the military they don't have access to the reparation of the victims as this normal, like, civilians. They get reparation by the institution. So if you get, like, this improvised explosive thing according with international law, that's a violation of the human, like, the international law, so you are a victim. But the way that they repair their own victims depends on the rank. So if I lost a leg and I'm a frontline soldier, the amount of money that I'm going to get is going to be significantly less if I'm a major or a higher commander. And they realized that when they start to acknowledge that they were also victims. So they needed to confront themselves when they saw that. And we published a couple of books in the National Center of History and Memory about military victims of the conflict. And in those conversations with the military victims, we realized how the institution probably even re-victimized their own members. And that was really hard for them to acknowledge, and they are not necessarily very outspoken about it. So there is this tension about like, okay, so we heroes, victims, but never perpetrators. But then when we are in this tension of these heroes and victims, we also need to acknowledge certain things that we are not doing as good. So I think that there is a disadvantage, and I'm going to tackle this with what Laura say about the socialization within the military. I'm actually writing a paper about it, and it is true. The institution in itself make really complex the possibility for the individuals to rebel or resist the institution in itself. However, I believe that is in these transitional moments when those dissonant voices can be empowered within the institutions. So if we were more aware of those voices as civilians that work with them, we can actually start to transform the army. So we start to put those people in leadership position within the military. Because it's good to have new thoughts, new ideas within the military. So I believe that there is a tension, but there is an opportunity when you are in transitional moments. But I think that we are losing that transition moment, to be honest. And about the individual and collective tension as well in terms of the narratives in transitional justice right now, I agree as well, Lara, that we are right now more in the collective narrative is using the bad apple argument. And because it's not being possible to actually, I argue that the Ministry of Defense and the new government should push a little bit more for the collective acknowledgement. And we can learn from what the military, even in Chile or Argentina, did in some point. I know that the context was different, but it was the transition and the collective acknowledgement of what they did, what actually helped to transform even the socialization process within those institutions. And finally, I think that I just want to comment something about what Peter said, which connects as well with my idea why positionality matters. And it's true, if you want to do a research that I'm doing as an international, I'm not sure if you're going to get the same information as I had as a local researcher. And it's been actually really interesting for me even to, when I'm presenting my research in front of locals and internationals, how some people can see my work with skeptical eyes. Because of many reasons. Some people probably believe that I'm right-wing because I'm studying the military, or other people can perceive me as a person who is not critical enough with the military, or that probably my gender. I got one time a comment saying that it was my gender what facilitates my relationship with the military. So I think positionality matters a lot in this relationship, and I've been seeing how nowadays, for example, I want to continue working with them, but it's becoming even harder. They are even more. It was easier in 2000 when I was doing my PhD than now. They are even more afraid of people working with them because they don't want anyone to criticize them, or they are really concerned about any kind of publication or findings that are against of their image that will portray them badly. So conducting research with them is really hard because they have particular expectations about your research. If you're going to portray something good about us, it's nice, but if not, you cannot work with us or you cannot publish your findings. So I'm working around that nowadays, but I think that's actually, again, we're losing a chance. Because if we allow the military, which is a public institution, or the police, which is a public institution, to actually be able to decide that nobody can do research about us and just us, how we can contribute to actually with new eyes or different approaches to reform or to think critically about that institution. So, and they don't have anyone telling them that they cannot do that. So again, I think that there is a lot of things there, but well, I'm still in the working.
Amazing. That's great. Thank you, Alejandra. So nice to see where you are taking us. I can see another hand up, and I invite the others to start putting your hands up because we're running out of time, and it'd be great to hear some of your thoughts or your comments on this. So, Lucia, over to you.
Thank you so much. I have more of a thought, and I'm almost embarrassed to share that. But I think, like, even when I knew that today's conversation is going to be about the military as well, I think I was just struck by how I've never thought about the military in the context of reconciliation. Because for me, like, I think always when I think about reconciliation, I would always consider sort of, I don't know, peace building organizations and NGOs. I would never think about an institution, but you're so right. This is a public institution that is there for the people originally, right? Like, that is the idea of the military as well. But also sort of, I'm so grateful for today's dialogue and everything you shared, Alejandra, because I also see sort of the connections I make to the military. And it's also, if you study the military, like, I mean, are you allowed to do that as someone who's interested in peace building and reconciliation? Is this something that sort of sparks you as someone who maybe has like other political beliefs that I find scary to think about? Like, so I think today has really faced me with a lot of my own prejudices. So I just wanted to say thanks so much, because this has been fascinating to me.
Great, thanks, Lucia. That's brilliant. I guess you could start thinking about how you bring your neuroscience and reconciliation training into the military to see if that's a way to tackle into that. But that probably is a different topic. I can see that Crystal is also with her hand up. So Crystal, over to you. You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. So thank you so much. This has been fascinating. And, you know, when I think about the military and the military code, the police code, and I think, you know, even in the US, there's a way of behaving. There's a way of acting together as one. And but what I'm wondering about too is I don't really know much about Colombia. So I'm wondering about what is the role of corruption within the military? And also, what is the role of corruption with outside actors, like other state actors, between the police, businesses, you know, even international? Is there, you know, is that something that we ought to also really be looking at?
Thank you, Crystal. That's let's see how we end up taking that into our dialogue. Paola, over to you. I'm afraid we cannot hear you. I've seen that you unmuted yourself, but we cannot hear you. Oh no, we cannot hear you. I'm sorry. No, still not. Probably you want to log out and log in again and see if you could try to make your point or your question. In the meantime, and knowing that Paola hasn't been able to share her thoughts, anyone else who would like to try to jump in with any other comment or question? Mafe, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Alejandra, for an amazing and thought-provoking experience. I very much appreciate how you bring complexity to the thing. And one of the issues that we need to deal with is stop thinking in binaries and the dyad of victim and perpetrator, and then the triad that you showed, that you mentioned. And I think we need, I mean, it has to move even farther than that. And I have worked with a group of people who are also always under suspicion, who are forensic experts of the Attorney General's office, who are always thought as the bad guys. So I really appreciate you bringing complexity to this discussion and this understanding of the military. But what I really liked is how confrontational it was for me. I'm more on the side of Andrei, of really needing, and what you said now at the end, that we need to demand from the military that they need to open the doors and allow researchers to be there, because if a huge part of the population if they want the trust of a huge part of the population, they need to acknowledge everything that they did as an institution. It's like the church with the priests raping children. It's the same. You need an institutional act of asking for forgiveness, but not just asking for forgiveness, but engaging in forms of acknowledging and repairing society somehow. I have no idea, and the HEP is there for that. But I really, really admire you for your ability to deal with these contradictions and not running away, but staying there, facing very uncomfortable situations, and facing, I don't know, all these, as I said, contradictions. So thank you for that.
I can tie something with that, because I think that there is two things that I would like to follow up. One is that Lucia was telling, I never thought about the military when I was thinking about reconciliation. And I think that in context of conflict and post-conflict scenarios, we still need to ensure the physical protection of civilians, and that come in hand by hand by the state armed actors. But if we know that the state armed actors are not necessarily there to protect us all, what kind of reconciliation we have with the state, that we should believe that the state is there to protect all of us? So that's why I think that a very crucial component, and also knowing from research in many cases around the world, that security is one of the main things that people want after a peace agreement. I mean, people just want to feel secure, and if we are unable to ensure physical security that depends of the security sector, we don't have even the baseline for thinking about reconciliation. The second thing is about, you were talking about, how these actors, how we as civilians, we should demand the openness of these institutions for research. And this being a huge conversation for me with them, because in my last conversation that I had with them, I told them it's like you going to the doctor, and the doctor probably can tell you that you have cancer, but you say to the doctor, you know what, you can do all the exams to me, but if you realize that I have cancer, please don't tell me that part I don't want to know. So if we really, and this is kind of my invitation to the military, if we really want the military to make an acknowledgement, but also to demonstrate that they want to change, that they are doing something to avoid what happened in Tierra Alta that just happened like this year, that we are talking about like behavior that persists even after the peace agreement and under the new government. If we really want to heal the relationship with the civilians, we need to be open to see the things that we don't like about ourselves and to use academia in our favor for that. I mean, think about the police in the US. There is a bunch of academics working with the police to reduce the racial bias. What if the police say to the academics, don't come to study us because, yes, we know that we abuse of the use of force against minorities, but we don't want you to do research about us. Well, there is a bunch of programs that have been successful in the field because of academics working with them to reduce that abuse. It's not being perfect, but things are going because of that relationship with academia. And finally, the question about corruption, I just shared with Crystal a policy brief that my students wrote last semesters about corruption and security sector. And we were trying to tie corruption with the transformation of the security sector in terms of how that this was more, I mean, this is kind of the current worries of the government, like the corruption within the security sector, and also how the war on drugs also incentivize corruption within the security sector. But we also thought about how the structure of the military is nowadays incentivize corruption. So in Colombia, if you want to be part of the military, I mean, it's mandatory to go to the military. If you don't have the green card or the military card, you cannot even access to certain jobs. The people that have money in Colombia can pay for it and not going to the military. So most part of, I mean, there is a whole pathway to get into the military that to some extent, I think that facilitates that people is there, not necessarily because they want to be there. So if we want to avoid that, we may need to think of a different way of recruitment, especially for certain people in certain areas, or investing in education, which was actually, I believe, one of the proposals of the new government, that was investing in education for the security, like members of the security sector, but the lower ranks, so that the lower ranks also have access to education, and not just necessarily the officers and sub-officers that actually pay what is equivalent to a university, a private university in Colombia. I don't know if you are aware of it. So all of these structures within the military, if we are able to change some of these institutions, we can help to transform behaviors within the military.
Thank you, Alejandra, for those thought-provoking ideas. And let's try one last time if we can get Paola into this, because she hasn't been able to share her thoughts or comments.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Andre. Thank you, everybody. It's a really interesting topic. I just would like to ask you, I'm not a PhD student, I'm not a researcher, but I'm really interested in politics. I was born in Colombia, of course. And so I would like to ask you, and this is related to the person we have yesterday here in Oxford, Santos. He was a Minister of Defense, of course, and I would like to ask you, in terms of the reconciliation, is it enough from him as a Minister of Defense that he expressed apologies to las Madres de Soacha and through the Three Commission? And but I think the people, the Madres de Soacha and some of the victims, they still feeling that this is not enough. So I would like to ask you if that's enough, really. What else? If we need something else from individuals, from the Minister of Defense, in order to have like a proper reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. And I think that's a great question to give the last word to Alejandra to do a wrap up, just to sort of give some context to the people who might not be aware yesterday, we hosted President Juan Manuel Santos and Ambassador Roy Barreras and the High Commission for Peace, Danilo Rueda, and Gwen Bornier, an academic at Oxford, to talk precisely about the lessons learned over the last decade in Colombia for peace processes. And Paola was referring to that dialogue. But I think that's a really interesting question. You know, someone as powerful as Santos won the Nobel Peace Prize, was the Minister of Defense. He has gone to the HEP, to Special Jurisdiction for Peace. He's gone to the Truth Commission. He has knowledge, asked for forgiveness. Is that enough or not? And for reconciliation. Alejandra, some last thoughts, and then I wrap up.
Well, I think that for reconciliation in general, probably for our narrative and history narrative, I think it contributes a lot. Actually, the contribution of Santos, especially when he was describing, when he realized it about falsos positivos, was beautiful, I believe. He was actually, I will say, he looks like very honest in the way that he actually confronted himself when that kind of new pop up into his desk, and the efforts that he tried to do to tackle that issues. And I think Juanita Gubertus, who was a politician staff, like he was part of that team that tried to transform from the legal side some of these behaviors of the security sector. But again, within the military, the narratives are very polarized at the moment. They feel under threat all the time. They feel any kind of critique is against them. And they are very afraid of losing legitimacy. And the thing is, it's really hard for them to understand that they can actually gain with legitimacy if they acknowledge the wrongs. They think that is the opposite. If they acknowledge the wrong, they will lose legitimacy. So I think that shift is something that is not happening there yet. And to be honest, I don't know if it's a question of time, if we are asking too much to the Colombian context, because this is a thing that is still countries like North Island is dealing with. I mean, all of this acknowledgement of the state armored actors is actually more difficult than the rebel side, because the rebel side want to be part of the society. But for state armored actors, because they were, and this is my argument as well in my thesis, is that the legal framework already say that you were in the good side. Because the violence, you know what I mean? I mean, the legal framework from the beginning say you were the one who was good because you were the legal one. So why you should accept that you were still doing something wrong if you were in the legal part? I mean, you were fighting the illegals. So that shifting of acknowledging that even when you are in the legal side, you were able to commit the wrongs, is the identity change or this identity crisis that the security sector and their own perception of how legitimacy works may need to change. And for this, I think that we need time sometimes. So yeah, that was probably will be my last comment.
Alejandra, and you made me think, I mean, with this last thing that you said, probably let's start the wrapping up. You know, could ever happen. The first flash memory that went through my mind is Pinochet in Chile. He never did it. Franco in Spain, a military who led the state and ordered what he ordered, never backtrack. And I've been trying to think about an example of a military who's done the opposite. And I know a couple of cases in the Philippines where a general, top general, actually has been doing examples of reconciliation, like Timochenko with Berta Fries, for example, a perpetrator and a victim. But very few cases in which I imagine a general of the army and a mother of Suacha going together talking about reconciliation. I mean, I think those cases are, I don't know if those cases exist in the world, but usually perpetrators of terrorists, former terrorists, if you want, end up reconciling with their victims, but very, in few cases, I've seen a member of a military who was the hero doing the same with a victim. And I don't know if that's something that we should think about. But that's, so I guess.
I'm just going to say something. If people like this topic, there is a beautiful literature in social psychology that talk about the moral superiority approach. And this is something that I argue, that the legal framework to some extent provide to the individuals this moral superiority approach. And that's why it's so difficult for them to acknowledge the wrongs of the past.
And I think for that reason, you have brought to our attention, I think, 3 key elements to continue thinking about it. I mean, the first one, when we are thinking about, you know, transitions in an armed conflict, is the relationship between a security sector reform for the need of reconciliation. So you have said, you know, this is not a matter of individuals, but when we are thinking about these deep transformations, you know, you cannot just get away trying to keep a reform that is, you know, just like the facade, but you really need to do security sector reform. And that's a very challenging thing to do. And you're absolutely right that you call our attention that that did not happen in the middle of the negotiations with the FARC. The military were not touched. So not only in Colombia, but in other countries where we are working on reconciliation processes in which the army has done wrongdoings, probably we need to think about the need of a security sector reform. The second thing that I think you have mentioned is, I think that you said that, so that's and that's difficult. So you are saying that's the big challenge for reconciliation. Now you have offered us also a positive side, I think, and is the second point, that is that transitions are an opportunity to do the security sector reform. That transitional justice mechanisms can be an opportunity to strengthen individuals within these institutions who are critical thinkers, who have the willingness to transform these institutions, and that you need to have the political will to focus on those, to strengthen them, and to go over to do these security sector reforms. So that's an opportunity for reconciliation in transitional justice processes, broadly understood. Now, the third and the final thing that I think you've been very strong about it and emphatic about it is that the academics can play a fundamental role in this, in particular when the army is willing to also open themselves to a dialogue with the academics, to revisit the past, in which they don't try to instrumentalize academics, in which they are really open for a sort of critical assessment of the past of what they have done. And I think that for an organization like ours, we, like Rodeemos el Diálogo and the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace and OxPeace, this idea of dialogue is such an important thing. And I think you've been inviting us to continue thinking about it. And we probably need to think about inviting in the next critical dialogues on reconciliation some military members, because I think you were right, and this will be the final point I make. They are deeply polarized. I think, and they feel that they have been wronged by the transitional justice institutions. So they now feel victims of transitional justice or the institution as such. And in a way, I think we need to open up to listen those frustrations, to try to find a way to navigate that. So to win critical friends within, as you have been suggesting, to try to move the country forward. So I think, you know, it's been a fascinating dialogue. As you can see, everyone here has been absolutely moved by your account, by your courage, by your critical thinking. And I would like to invite our members here to turn their cameras on and to give you a round of applause to end this critical dialogue on reconciliation. So thank you, Alejandra.
Thank you all for staying the whole conversation. And yes, it was really nice to share with you some thoughts and ideas. So please send an email if you want to know stuff around my work, or even just have a conversation. If I go to the UK, I will just email Andre and say, if someone wants to drink a coffee with me and hang out. Take care of yourself. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. Maybe we can cross paths in Bogota.
Well, I'm in Germany, but we can meet one time.